General Hospital spoilers tease that the explosion at Charlie's pub sent shockwaves through Port Charles, both literally and figuratively. Once a warm, familiar sanctuary filled with laughter, arguments, and the scent of comfort food, the pub was reduced to chaos in an instant. The attack, orchestrated with chilling precision, wasn't just an act of vengeance, it was a message. And Christina was the unwitting recipient. Trapped inside at the moment of impact, she had no warning. No time to run. No chance to escape. One moment she was behind the bar wiping down glasses. And the next, the world around her erupted into fire and smoke. Flames licked up the walls. The blast blew out windows, tore through furniture, and tossed bottles into the air like missiles. Christina, hurled backward from the force of the explosion, hit the ground unconscious as burning debris collapsed around her. Her body lay still amidst the wreckage, surrounded by the smell of ash and gasoline. Outside, stunned bystanders screamed, sirens began to wail, and a panicked Alexis rushed to the scene after a frantic call. This was no accident. This was the opening salvo of a dark and calculated war. Gen Sidwell had promised retaliation, and he had delivered it with terrifying brutality. His failed attempt to buy Sonny's criminal empire had turned personal, and now he wasn't just coming after territory or power, he was targeting Sonny's heart. And nothing struck deeper than threatening one of Sonny's children. For Christina, this wasn't just an explosion. It was the collapse of her sense of security. A shattering blow to her already fragile mental health. Having spent years grappling with identity crises, emotional instability, and the burden of living in Sonny's shadow, Christina now faced a new trauma, one she might not survive. As emergency responders pulled her from the wreckage, her body bloodied and broken. The question on everyone's lips wasn't just whether she would live, but whether she would ever be the same. At the hospital, doctors fought to stabilize her. Smoke inhalation, internal bleeding, burns, every second became critical. Alexis stood over her daughter's broken form, trembling with rage and grief, and in that moment, a line was drawn. No more excuses. No more tolerance for the life Sonny had built. "I will not bury another daughter," she whispered, echoing her haunting plea to a God she no longer believed in. Meanwhile, Sonny, shaken but determined, stared at the smoldering remains of the pub. The place where so many memories were made was now a battleground. And he knew, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Christina. About his family. About every soul in Port Charles who might become collateral damage in this escalating war. Jason, returned to town and already neck-deep in Sonny's operations, vowed to find Sidwell and make him pay. But even as he suited up for battle, there was an edge of hesitation in his eyes. What if this wasn't the last attack? What if Daisy was next? What if this war didn't just end in blood, but in total ruin? Back at the hospital, as Christina hovered between life and death, the ripple effects of the bombing began to spread. Molly blamed herself for not being there. Sam, who was still mourning her own losses, fell into a quiet fury. Dante, juggling his duty as a cop and his loyalty to Sonny, found himself torn. And Alexis, once content to watch from the sidelines, realized she could no longer remain neutral. She wanted justice, not just for Christina, but for every child destroyed by the choices of men like Sonny and Sidwell. And so, as the ashes settled and Port Charles held its breath, the city stood on the brink. The bombing of Charlie's pub wasn't just a singular, horrifying event. It was a sign of the chaos to come. A warning that the war had officially begun. And for Christina, if she survived, there would be no going back. Only forward, into the fire. The rising tension in Port Charles had reached a boiling point, and all roads now led to one man, Sidwell. Sonny had seen betrayal before. He had weathered wars with rival families, dodged bullets, buried loved ones, and buried enemies even deeper. But what was happening now, this wasn't just business. It was personal. It was war disguised as calculated vengeance. And Sonny knew exactly who was pulling the strings behind the chaos engulfing his family. Sidwell. The man with the polished suit. The hollow smile, and a vendetta that had grown too bold, too dangerous, and too personal to ignore. At first, Sonny had underestimated Sidwell, just another ambitious outsider with delusions of grandeur. Someone who thought they could buy their way into the Port Charles underworld and take over the empire Sonny had bled to build. But Sidwell had taken the rejection like a predator takes a wound, not with submission, but with fury. Sonny's refusal to sell had lit a fuse. And now that fuse had sparked the explosion at Charlie's pub, the near-fatal injuries to Christina, and a series of calculated moves that reeked of personal retribution. It was no longer about money, territory, or power. Sidwell was coming for blood. And Natalia was the first crack in the armor. Sonny had been building something fragile and real with Natalia. A second chance at peace after a lifetime of war. But Sidwell had found a way to shatter it. Rumors swirled that Sidwell had planted threats around Natalia, using her past vulnerabilities and current fears to send Sonny a message: no one in his life would be safe. Not Natalia. Not Kristina. Not even Donna and Avery. The timing of the pub bombing and Natalia's recent scare wasn't coincidence. It was strategy, designed to destabilize Sonny emotionally and tactically. And it was working. Sidwell was proving to be a different kind of threat. He didn't operate with guns on street corners or armies in alleyways. He played psychological warfare, using fear, manipulation, and precision to destroy from the inside. He had resources, connections, and patience, the kind that made him far more lethal than the traditional enemies Sonny was used to crushing. And as the fire still smoldered at Charlie's, Sonny realized something terrifying. Sidwell wasn't just targeting his organization. He was targeting his soul, his family. Christina, fragile in the wake of the blast, had become the human cost of this vendetta. She was caught in the middle of a war she didn't start and might not survive. Her mental health, already tested by years of emotional trauma and family chaos, was now dangling over a precipice. The sight of her lying in the hospital, unconscious and bruised, had flipped a switch in Sonny. The fear in Alexis's voice. The panic in Sam's eyes. The guilt flooding through Molly. It all settled into Sonny's chest like concrete. He couldn't afford to let Sidwell strike again. Sonny had always been a man who believed in preemptive strikes. You don't wait for your enemy to hit you twice. You end it before the next blow lands. And this time, there would be no hesitation. Sidwell was no longer just a threat to business, he was a threat to blood. To children. To women. To the ones Sonny had sworn to protect. And so Sonny began to mobilize. He made calls to people who owed him favors from other cities. He reopened files he'd long kept sealed. He brought Jason into the inner circle and asked him to dig deep. Every transaction. Every move Sidwell had made since arriving in Port Charles. No stone would be left unturned. But Sonny also knew he had to play this war differently. Sidwell thrived on chaos, on Sonny's temper. On pushing emotional buttons. A loud retaliation would be exactly what Sidwell expected. So instead, Sonny would move in silence. Not with bullets, at least not at first. But with leverage. Exposure. Strategy. If Sidwell wanted to play chess, Sonny would be 3 moves ahead. He would use Sidwell's arrogance against him. He would exploit every weakness. And when the time was right, he would destroy him so thoroughly that no one would ever dare come after his family again. But time was running out. Christina's condition remained critical. And every hour that passed without answers felt like a countdown to another tragedy. The Corinthos family was fractured, some blaming Sonny for bringing danger too close. Others quietly waiting for his next move. Natalia had grown distant, shaken by how quickly her life had turned into a target. And Sidwell remained in the shadows, watching, waiting, calculating. What no one realized yet was that this wasn't Sidwell's endgame. It was only the beginning. Because if Sonny didn't stop him soon, the next explosion might not be aimed at a building. It might be aimed at someone's heart. Christina's fragile body lay surrounded by machines, the steady hum of monitors barely masking the dread that gripped her loved ones. The explosion at Charlie's pub had left her fighting for her life, trapped between the flicker of consciousness and the pull of darkness. Doctors were running out of time. And the one thing they needed, an urgent, rare tissue match for a transplant, was proving impossible to find. Until Alexis and Sonny stepped forward, both willing to give anything. Even pieces of themselves, to save the daughter who had always walked the line between love and torment. It was a moment that silenced every feud, every resentment, every scar between them. For once, Alexis and Sonny stood on the same side, not as enemies or former lovers, but as parents trembling before the terrifying possibility that they might lose their child. Alexis, whose guilt over the past already weighed heavily on her soul, saw this as her chance at redemption. Sonny, whose world had been built on protecting those he loved, knew that nothing else mattered, not his empire, not his pride, not his power, if Christina didn't make it out of that hospital alive. The doctors were stunned by the offers. Both Alexis and Sonny were willing to undergo invasive testing and surgery if it meant even a sliver of hope for Christina's survival. It was rare, almost unheard of, for both biological parents to qualify as viable organ donors in such dire circumstances, but this was Port Charles, where miracles were forged from desperation and love. As the hospital staff scrambled to analyze lab results, whispers of the potential transplant swept through General Hospital, igniting a wave of emotional chaos that threatened to fracture already strained relationships. The possibility that either Alexis or Sonny would have to undergo a risky procedure to keep Christina alive sent shockwaves across their respective circles. Molly and Sam were thrown into an emotional storm, torn between their mother's selfless determination and the fear of losing her too. Michael, watching his father haunted and hollowed, began to confront the terrifying truth of what it meant to love someone who could disappear in a heartbeat. Even Ava, distant but observant, found herself moved by the raw humanity unraveling before her. And beneath it all was the devastating realization that Christina had become a symbol of so much more than tragedy. She was the embodiment of sacrifice, of fractured families, of the lengths to which parents would go to undo the damage the world had inflicted on their children. She was the crossroads at which Alexis and Sonny finally found themselves again, not as bitter exes, not as opposing forces, but as two people who had once created life together and now stood ready to preserve it at any cost. But with every hour that passed, Christina's condition worsened. The swelling in her brain, the internal damage from the blast, the complications from smoke inhalation, everything compounded to create a ticking clock that no one could ignore. When the call finally came that one parent matched the necessary markers for the life-saving transplant, Alexis and Sonny both demanded it be them. Each insisted on taking the risk, each refusing to let the other carry the burden alone. And so a new battle began, not against each other, but against fate itself. If Christina survived, she would awaken to a world where her parents had gone to war with mortality itself for her sake. But if she didn't, if the procedure failed, then one of them would have bled, suffered, and risked everything only to watch their child slip away. That fear, that haunting possibility, became the ghost that stalked every hallway in the hospital. The transplant was scheduled. Security was tightened. The operating rooms were prepped. And as the surgical team prepared to begin, Alexis and Sonny shared a quiet, grief-soaked moment, eyes locked, hearts shattered. United not in hope, but in a shared willingness to bleed for the same soul. In that moment, it wasn't just a fight for Christina's life. It was a reckoning. It was love in its most terrifying, selfless form. It was the kind of sacrifice that left permanent scars, on the body, on the heart, and on the soul. The death of Christina shattered not only the Corinthos family but the very soul of Port Charles itself. It was more than the loss of a young woman caught in the crossfire of a war she never asked to be part of. It was the annihilation of innocence, of hope. Of the fragile belief that love and sacrifice could somehow conquer fate. For Sonny and Alexis, her parents, the grief was not just overwhelming, it was annihilating. A cataclysmic emotional storm that tore through everything they thought they understood about protection, redemption, and unconditional love. They had tried to save her. They had begged, bled, and bargained with doctors, destiny, and each other to pull Christina back from the brink. But in the end, not even a father's power or a mother's devotion was enough. In the sterile silence of General Hospital, time itself seemed to fracture. Alexis had offered her liver. Sonny had offered his blood. Both had signed every waiver, agreed to every risk. Pleaded with every specialist to try what had never been tried before. The doctors had hoped. The staff had prayed. And for one fleeting moment, there was the illusion that maybe, just maybe, they could defy death itself. But that hope was extinguished just like the fire that had gutted Charlie's pub. In a single heartbeat, it was over. Christina's body, fragile and burned, simply could not carry the weight of so much damage. She slipped away in the early hours of the morning, without a word, without a final goodbye. Only silence. Only stillness. The moment Alexis was told, her world collapsed. The sound that escaped her throat wasn't a scream, it was the unmaking of a mother's soul. She staggered into the hallway, clawing at her own skin as if trying to rip out the pain. She had lost Sam to fate's cruelty, and now Christina too. The two daughters she had birthed and raised were both gone, one consumed by madness and the other by fire. Alexis could not speak. Could not breathe. Could not understand how the universe could be so merciless. She collapsed onto the floor, shaking, unable to stop whispering Christina's name over and over. As if her voice alone could bring her child back from the dead. Sonny, meanwhile, stood like a statue made of grief and rage. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply stood by the hospital window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft oranges and reds, mocking the loss that had turned his world black. He had always been a man of action, he took, he punished, he protected. But there was no enemy he could shoot, no deal he could make, no rival to threaten that could undo this. Christina was dead. And worse. She died not knowing that Sonny would have burned the world to keep her alive. That truth broke him more than anything ever had. And that rage, that guilt, began to fester inside him like an uncontrollable inferno. It wouldn't be long before it demanded blood. Back at the remains of Charlie's pub, investigators combed through the wreckage while sirens still echoed faintly through the streets. Burnt wood, shattered glass, and the sickening stench of smoke were all that remained of the place Christina once dreamed of rebuilding into a space of hope and healing. Now it was a mausoleum. The explosion had left her broken. And it had ignited a war. Sonny didn't need evidence. He didn't need a confession. In his heart, he knew Sidwell was behind it. The man had threatened his family, tried to buy his empire, and been humiliated when he was turned down. This bombing was Sidwell's revenge, and Christina was the price. What followed was a descent. Sonny launched into action with lethal focus. He called in debts, summoned old allies, and began erasing every link Sidwell had in Port Charles. Warehouses were raided. Accounts frozen. Allies disappeared. Sonny's empire didn't just retaliate, it consumed. But even as he moved like a shadow of vengeance, the grief never left him. It was stitched into every breath. Every order. Every silence between phone calls. Because this wasn't just war. It was mourning turned into murder. The only way Sonny could live with what had happened was to ensure someone else paid. Alexis, meanwhile, retreated into a silence so complete it terrified even those closest to her. She stopped eating. Stopped answering her phone. She locked herself in Christina's room and sat there for hours. Sometimes days, talking to the air, as if her daughter might answer. She blamed Sonny. She blamed herself. She blamed the doctors, the city, the world. But in her quietest moments, she blamed the past, the endless cycles of violence, ambition, and power that had always devoured everything they touched. The ripple effects of Kristina's death reached everyone. Molly couldn't sleep. TJ abandoned the hospital for days, unable to return to the place where he had seen Kristina's broken body wheeled away. Even Michael and Willow, caught in their own storm of chaos, paused to mourn. And yet, for all the tears, the fear, and the whispered condolences, nothing stopped the darkness from thickening. Because no one knew what Sonny would do next. And no one knew how far he was willing to go to avenge his daughter. And then came the letter. Delivered anonymously to Alexis, it was found tucked inside a bouquet of lilies at her front door. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Kristina's. She had written it a week before the explosion, tucked it away in case anything ever happened to her. In it, she spoke of forgiveness. Of peace. Of wanting her family to find healing, not vengeance. She begged them not to let her death become a weapon. But by then, it was too late. The fire had already been lit, in Sonny's eyes. In Alexis's soul, in the blood running through every Corinthos and Davis. Kristina's death had not just changed them. It had broken them. There would be no peace now. Only reckoning. And so, as Port Charles braced for the next explosion, be it literal or emotional, one thing was certain, Kristina Corinthos had died in a fire. But the true inferno had only just begun. The escalating war between Sonny and Sidwell has now reached a point of no return. Transforming Port Charles into a ticking time bomb where the shadows are thick with dread and death lingers in the air like smoke that never quite clears. What began as a simple power play has erupted into a campaign of destruction, fueled by bloodlust, pride, and the burning grief that now defines Sonny's every breath. The death of Kristina was not the conclusion, it was the ignition. And now, every move that Sonny makes, every order he issues, every enemy he neutralizes, is driven by a rage so raw it threatens to unravel the entire fabric of the town. Sidwell, for his part, remains a ghost in the machine, calculating, methodical, and unrepentant. His silence is not weakness but strategy, and his refusal to back down has only poured fuel on Sonny's fire. With each passing day, Sidwell chips away at the power structures Sonny once dominated without challenge. Allies are turning. Informants are vanishing. Territories once considered sacred are now contested ground. But more disturbingly, Sidwell's war is not just about empire, it is personal. He has made it clear that Sonny's bloodline is fair game. Kristina's death was just the first strike. And now whispers swirl through back alleys and dimly lit clubs. Someone else will die. The only question is who. The threat has cast a dark cloud over Sonny's family. Ava is on edge. Carly is doubling her security, and Donna and Avery are being kept under lock and key with guards posted at every turn. But Sonny knows better than anyone that when death wants to strike, it finds a way. No fortress, no gun, no threat has ever been enough to stop fate. And fate, it seems, has taken a brutal interest in the Corinthos family. Jason has returned to stand by Sonny's side. But even his cold precision can't erase the unease. The PCPD is stretched thin, riddled with corruption and hesitation, unable to contain the war that has spilled into the streets. Chase and Dante are doing all they can, but their hands are tied by red tape and divided loyalties. And in the silence of Sonny's penthouse, as he watches the city from behind bulletproof glass, he knows one thing above all else, another death is coming. And it may be someone he loves. Alexis, still reeling from Kristina's loss, is spiraling deeper into despair. She warns Sonny. Pleaded with him to abandon the path of vengeance, to let justice, not revenge, speak for their daughter. But her words were drowned out by the roar of a man who has lost too much and refuses to lose again. Now, with each passing night, Alexis feels the weight of inevitability pressing down on her chest. She dreams of coffins. She imagines funerals. And she cannot shake the certainty that another tragedy is about to strike. And the town feels it too. Port Charles is no stranger to violence. But there is something different now, an electricity in the air, a tension that cannot be named but is felt in every glance, every whisper, every sudden noise that makes people jump. Children are being kept indoors. Business owners are locking up early. Even the criminals are watching their backs. Because they all know, Sonny doesn't forgive. Sidwell doesn't negotiate. And between them, death is a currency that's being spent freely. As this deadly chess game unfolds, alliances will shatter. Old enemies will rise. And the body count will climb. The citizens of Port Charles may try to carry on as though life is normal, but deep down, everyone knows the truth. War has come. And in war, no one is ever truly safe. Not the innocent. Not the guilty. Not the powerful. And certainly not the broken-hearted. The question now is not if someone else will die, it's when, where, and how devastating the loss will be. Port Charles stands on the edge of the abyss, and the fall has only just begun.